with that in mind, now that we've got a good amount of a little bit of pre-gaming, I think we're ready for the Climate Town video on how to steal an election, grand theft presidency.
Every 4 years, Americans across this great nation put our differences aside to join hands and collectively lose our fucking minds over the presidential election.
Turn out for what? We singing Trump, Trump!
They're eating the dogs.
Now, we've seen some pretty crazy stuff in recent years, but if you're thinking 2020 was the most hog-wild election in modern history, you have absolutely got to hear about what went down in the year 2000. Because if you're some kind of rizless Gen Z damn-danieling sheesh lord, you may be surprised to hear that in the year 2000, there was a literal and verifiable stolen presidential election. And even if you're over the age of 30 and maybe remember hearing something about hanging chads and Florida recounts, the details are certifiably insane. And if nothing else, it's good to just remind ourselves of the fragility of elections in the United States and why your vote, yes, I'm talking to you, really does matter in shaping the next 4 years. And hell, I'll say it, I'm crazy, maybe even beyond. Hi, I'm Raleigh Williams,
Let's not get too crazy, Mr. Town. Mr. Climate Town, if that even is your real name.
Science and policy degree, and a raging obsession with an election that happened almost a quarter of a century ago. And this is a video about stealing a presidential election. Welcome to Climate Town. In the year 1999, a significant portion of the country genuinely believed that when the date rolled over from 99 to 00, all of our computers would self-destruct, launch the nukes, and destroy America's economy. It was called Y2K, and it was a dumb thing to be afraid of, but in their defense, in 1999, computers looked like this.
Computers did look pretty shit, but I do the recorder meme.
But the new year came and went, and with Y2K safely in the rearview mirror, Americans could focus on the two things that really mattered. The hit single Who Let the Dogs Out by the Baha Men,
Who let the dogs out?
and the 2000 presidential election.
Choose your character.
In the blue corner was Al Gore. He cut his teeth as a Democratic senator from Tennessee before becoming vice president to a saxophone-toting, sexual relations with that woman-denying president by the name of Bill Clinton. Gore released a best-selling book about global warming and the environment back here in 1992. He released the award-winning documentary An Inconvenient Truth that supercharged climate change awareness here in 2006. But here in 2000, he's running for president.
Today, I announce that I am a candidate for President of the United States.
And in the red corner is George W. Bush. Not to be confused with his father and the president from 8 years earlier, George H.W. Bush. George Regular W. Bush was a Texas oil man who founded an oil and gas exploration firm, then became the co-owner of the Texas Rangers, and then became the governor of Texas, and in the year 2000, he's the Republican candidate for president.
We will renew America's purpose.
It's Gore versus Bush. It's Climate Guy versus Texas Oil Man. It's election 2000, and it's right now.
Who let the dogs out? Who let the...
And if you're wondering why they're all so focused on a big map, it's because America doesn't have a simple democratic election where the candidate with the most votes wins. We have the much stupider electoral college, where states are assigned point values and each candidate tries to win the highest stakes board game on earth. And that means close elections can often come down to just a couple of states that could swing either way. But remember, this is also a TV show, which means networks are foaming at the mouth to call states as early and often as they can, filling up the map and making politics feel like Wheel of Fortune.
George Bush, he carries his home state of Texas.
Washington State goes for Gore.
Sarah, you hit the jackpot with $1 million.
And then, at 7:49 p.m. Eastern Time, NBC felt they asked enough Floridians exiting the polls who they voted for, and they were ready to make the call.
So sorry to interrupt you. Mike, you know I wouldn't do this if it weren't big. Florida goes for Al Gore.
It was massive. Florida had 25 electoral votes, and if Gore took it, the Bush path to victory looked rail thin. The other networks followed suit, and it seemed like a wrap then and there. Except it wasn't a wrap, because as actual voting data replaced exit polling data, Gore's lead began to shrink. And something positively weird was going on, because Florida polling stations were inundated with voters calling to say they were confused about the ballot and they were worried that their vote might have gone to the wrong person. Curious! Then, 2 hours later at 9:55 p.m.,
NBC News is now taking Florida out of Vice President Gore's column and putting it back in the too close to call column.
As the other states fell into place, only Florida was left undecided, which means whoever won Florida would win the election. Then at 2:16 a.m., roughly 6 hours past their target demo's bedtime,
Fox News now projects George W. Bush the winner in Florida, and thus it appears the winner of the presidency of the United States.
The other networks followed suit, and Al Gore was left sitting in a hotel room staring at every major news network in the country, telling him he had lost an election that all the exit polling data said he had won. So Al Gore picked up the phone, called Bush to concede, and then left to go deliver the official concession speech. The thing is, Al Gore had not lost the presidential election. Yeah, and he would have known that if he had thought to call his own numbers guy, Michael Hooley, who was keeping careful track of the Florida vote.
He said, "We're at the War Memorial," and I asked why, and he said, "We're about to concede." And I said, "For what? We haven't lost."
The whole thing was a clusterfuck in a number of ways, but most importantly, it was so close that it had automatically triggered Florida Election Code 102.141, legally requiring an automatic recount of all the votes in the state. This election was not over. But Al Gore didn't know that, and was literally walking to the stage to concede the election when his senior advisor David Morehouse ran his ass down and stopped him. The drama. Imagine that moment. I wish I had a clip of it. I don't, but I super wish I did. Luckily, HBO made a made-for-TV movie about the 2000 election, and it did include this goofy-ass reenactment.
No, Mr. Vice President! Mr. Vice President! Mr. Vice President! Mr. Vice President? Mr. Vice President? Sir?
I'm not going to keep
Please,
him waiting.
please, Mr. Vice President. There's a problem with the numbers in Florida.
And then, in the most awkward phone call of his entire life, Gore called Bush back to unconcede. As you can imagine, Bush was pretty fucking pissed. The conversation got heated, and Gore apparently ended the call with something to the effect of, "I don't care what your little brother says, this isn't over." And that's a pretty badass thing to say. It's also a little confusing, but in this case it makes perfect sense because George Bush's little brother is Jeb Bush. And in the year 2000, Jeb Bush was the governor of Florida.
I told my brother that we were going to carry Florida for him. Is that going to be a truthful statement?
Dude, he had so much more charisma. What the fuck
So
happened?
the race moved to the Sunshine State, where the 5.8 million votes cast in Florida would be machine recounted to see if Bush's 1,784 vote lead would hold. And as the computers rescanned the votes, Bush's lead steadily shrank down to just 327 votes. But that's not all. There were an additional 171,000 ballots that the machines had just skipped because either they couldn't read any vote or they read multiple votes. Which makes sense if you remember the many calls on election day about confusing ballots and defective equipment. These are the same computers that we thought might fire nuclear weapons at Russia if they weren't sure what year it was. Good thing Florida state law says we'll take these 171,000 ballots and recount them by hand, right?
Florida law, and the law in many other states, calls for a careful check by real people of the machine results in elections like this one.
But Team Bush had a slightly different take. They wanted to not count any more votes and declare George Bush president immediately. And in situations like this, you'd hope there'd be someone to step in and say, "Get f***ed, we're counting all the votes." I'd even settle for a simple, sorry, but counting votes is how democracy worked. And that person should have been Florida Secretary of State Katherine Harris. Now, in a wild coincidence, the co-chair of George Bush's Florida presidential campaign was also a woman named Katherine Harris, and in an even wilder coincidence, it was the same person. That's right, both the Florida governor and the Secretary of State in charge of maintaining the integrity of the election had actively campaigned for George Bush, which is a really hard position to be in if you're Al Gore. Luckily, he did have one thing going for him. He got more votes in Florida than George Bush did. That's right, we now know for sure that Gore got more votes in Florida than Bush. By kind of a lot. Unfortunately, some serious problems with Florida's voting system invalidated literally thousands of ballots that would have gone for Gore.
Dude, maybe I haven't had enough caffeine today or something. I feel like I'm walking into like the perfume aisle. The editing is like, it's like blasting my senses. I like it, don't get me wrong, but I'm like, oh my God.
Good God, people, this election is a mess. First off, thousands of voters across the whole state of Florida showed up to the polls and found they're not allowed to vote. That's right, newly elected governor and longtime little brother Jeb Bush oversaw a purge of the voter rolls that accidentally included a lot of legal voters who overwhelmingly voted Democratic.
He looked at the roll and he looked at me and he said, "We have a problem, you're not on the roll."
Sorry about that. Now, down here in Palm Beach County, they used a ballot with such bad graphic design that thousands of Democratic Jewish voters accidentally voted for the alt-right anti-Semitic candidate Pat Buchanan.
The Democrats were listed second. I punched the second hole, and that second hole was for Pat Buchanan.
And this is not just like my opinion, man. Here's Pat Buchanan himself.
If the two candidates they pushed were Buchanan and Gore, almost certainly those are Al Gore's votes and not mine.
And as if printing your ballots on a bunch of goddamn origami cranes isn't bad enough, voters up here in Duval County were instructed to vote on every page of their ballot. But anyone who followed those instructions had their vote invalidated because there were 2 pages of presidential candidates. And these aren't just like a couple of votes. In Florida, there was a vote for Gore on 84,000 of these invalid multi-vote ballots compared to just 37,000 multi-vote ballots that included Bush. But the Bush legal team was prepared to swear on their mothers' lives that a bunch of elderly Jewish Democrats had voted alt-right and that the multi-vote ballots were uncountable because technically there's no way to tell for sure who the voter was trying to vote for. Not even if the candidates were Al Gore and also popular write-in candidate Al Gore.
You want to be ideologically pure, or do you want to win? They said we want to win.
And under the time pressure, there seemed to be no practical way for the Gore legal team to contest any of those multi-votes, the accidental Buchanan votes, or the purged votes. That's thousands of votes flushed away, man. But wait, because there was a ballot issue that they could go after. In some counties, voters have to punch out little paper circles known as chads. It sounds simple, but sometimes that chad hangs on for dear life. And other times, that chad receptacle fills up so goddamn full that you can't punch yours out at all. Now you got yourself one of the thousands of pregnant or dimpled chad ballots that never got counted. But since these chad-stricken no votes could indicate just one candidate, the Gore team set their sights on hand recounting ballots with pregnant or dimpled or swinging chads, and in doing so, ushered in a dynasty of just the absolute hackiest talk show jokes.
I had to go to the doctor today. You know why? I have a hanging chad.
And so the entire 2000 presidential election basically came down to 61,000 ballots in Florida that machines thought were blank, Would they be counted or would they be thrown away? We'll find out next time. Just kidding, let's find out right now. The Gore team struck first by requesting recounts in just 4 heavily Democratic counties where they thought they'd uncover a boatload of dimpled and hanging Chad ballots with Al Gore's name all over them. The Bush team immediately sues to stop the hand recounts on the grounds that Gore was selecting favorable counties. Gore counters in a televised address.
I am also prepared, if Governor Bush prefers, to include in this recount all the counties in the entire state of Florida.
Bush ignores the offer and doubles down on the lawsuit to stop the 4 recounts, but loses the case and the recounts are a go. Point Gore. But the Bush bench is deep. They had to let the recount start, but no one said they had to let it finish. So Secretary of State and Team Bush MVP Katherine Harris tightened the recount deadline, and Republicans worked to slow down the actual vote counting itself. They argued over every vote.
Vote for 6 Republican Party challenges.
4 more votes for Gore. Election Supervisor Jane Carroll, a Republican, voted against this count.
They had to shut down the counting temporarily because the canvassing board members had to run to court to go appear before the judge to talk about whether or not we were eating Chads.
Katherine Harris then attempted to stop the entire hand recount early.
I've decided it is my duty under Florida law to exercise my discretion in denying these requested amendments.
But was denied by the Florida Supreme Court. Undeterred, Katherine Harris follows up by stating she won't accept any recounts unless they're completely finished in the next 3 days. The Gore legal team says, hey, you can't do that, and the Florida Supreme Court steps in and says, stop f***ing around, and gives them a week to do the recount. There was only one question left on everybody's mind.
Who let the dogs out?
Sorry, no, who would win this election? With the recount in full swing, things looked very good for Gore. He picked up 93 new votes in Volusia County, and if their projections were right, Gore would win another 300 to 400 votes in Palm Beach, another 100 in Miami-Dade, and up to 500 in Broward County. Even on the low side, that would be enough to put Al Gore right back on top. Pretty good news for the Democrats. The Republicans, on the other hand, weren't about to let a lead slip away. They devised a new method to ensure none of those votes got counted. In Miami-Dade, a young Roger Stone had teamed up with other Republican operatives, and while the hand recount was happening on the 18th floor of the Clark Center building, a horde of what appeared to be angry Floridian protesters stormed the building. Stop the count, stop the fraud. An instant classic. This horde of men in suits, banging on windows, and attempting to disrupt an American presidential election would become known as the Brooks Brothers riot. After one of Gore's lawyers was chased down and harassed for the crime of having a sample ballot in his hand, the Miami-Dade Canvassing Board felt sufficiently threatened, and they had had enough. They stopped the recount. And if you're wondering if this was a spontaneous bunch of protesters or some kind of group of Republican operatives trying to steal an election for their team, here's a picture I think can really answer that question. No recount means no change in votes from Miami-Dade. But surely
all of them? GOP? All of them? Oops, all operatives.
The Palm Beach County votes could go Gore's way, right? Yeah, they could have, if they had finished the recount. But since Katherine Harris was Secretary of State, she was able to move the Palm Beach County deadline up a day to the Sunday after Thanksgiving.
So the Secretary of State has apparently decided to shut us down with approximately 2 hours perhaps left to go. And that's how she chose to exercise her discretion. We believe there are approximately 800 to 1,000 ballots left to count. So unfortunately, at this time, we have no other choice but then to shut down. The Supervisor for Elections needs to hurriedly gather all the paperwork and prepare to file the returns that we have. We certainly don't want to get anything in there at 5:01.
Palm Beach submitted a partial recount, and Katherine Harris gave him the old 2 for flinching and rejected it for being incomplete. Once again, Al Gore would get none of the newly counted votes, and it looked like this whole refusing to count votes in a Democratic election was a real winning strategy for Team Bush.
I hereby declare Governor George W. Bush the winner of Florida's 25 electoral votes for the President of the United States.
But not so fast, Jackson, because Team Gore knows how to play the hits. They filed yet another lawsuit, and the Florida Supreme Court decided that they weren't going to let a bunch of computers that looked like this and George Bush's two best friends decide who got to be president.
The court shall order a manual recount of all undervotes in any Florida county where such a recount has not yet occurred.
The Florida Supreme Court ordered a hand recount of the entire state, because they weren't about to let Florida be the butt of everybody's jokes for the next 24 years. That's right, it's the Supreme Court of the United States. And under the flimsiest of legal pretext, they've decided to take Bush's case. Rather than let Florida complete a legally mandated hand recount of their own votes, the 5 Republican-appointed conservative justices closed ranks and voted 5-4 to stop the count and end the election, officially handing the presidency to the guy who both lost the popular vote and received fewer votes in the deciding state. 5-4, huh? So you do understand democracy. And as if to admit that they shouldn't have stepped in to subvert an election, the 5 conservative majority Supreme Court ruled for possibly the first and only time that this decision was not precedent. It would only apply in this one case, so let's all just forget about the time a conservative Supreme Court stepped in and stopped an election that was actively counting votes and handed it to the Republican. And there have been some incredible think pieces written about this whole affair, but possibly the best quote comes from the dissenting opinion of Justice John Paul Stevens. Although we may never know with complete certainty the identity of the winner of this year's presidential election, the identity of the loser is perfectly clear. It is the nation's confidence in the judge as an impartial guardian of the rule of law. And that is how the US presidency ended up in George Regular W. Bush's hands in the year 2000. Honestly, it's a pretty depressing story, and you might even be wondering why I decided to cover it. Well, here's the thing. It's a presidential election year once again. You probably wish it wasn't, and after hearing me smash through all the ways the 2000 election got absolutely borked by some little brothers and a bunch of the guys from that scene in Wolf of Wall Street, you might even find yourself thinking, what's the point in voting when these dudes can just come in and swipe an election? But here's how I see it. The biggest problem with the 2000 election was that it was too goddamn close. Sure, this kind of thing is exciting as hell.
Is this the dagger?
But this is the election for the President of the United States. And when we're trying to finally double down on the biggest pieces of climate legislation ever, we don't want a buzzer beater. We want to win by 40. We want a blowout. We want to light the scoreboard up so hot it becomes self-aware like in the movie Space Jam. But I'm not out here trying to advocate for voting for the climate on vibes alone, baby. So we teamed up with our friends over at Evergreen Action to take a look at what the actual climate stakes of this election are and why you getting yourself registered to vote and then actually going to the polls is 100% worth your time. Now, obviously,
Dude, I'm not gonna lie. After the 20-minute prologue, it's like now I'm already gonna vote, and now I don't want to vote. Oh.
I cannot predict the future. If I could, I wouldn't be making YouTube videos. I would be out predicting shit. I don't know what it would be, but I know I would get it right. But thanks to the predictive modeling of a nonpartisan energy and environmental policy firm called Energy Innovation, we can get a pretty good approximation of what our climate future might look like. Here's their projection of greenhouse gas emissions in the US based on 3 scenarios. In gray, we have a business as usual model that takes into account the federal policies we've currently got in place, such as the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, as well as energy trends and technology costs. Notice the general downward trend of the line that kind of levels off around 2035. Now let's take a look at another line. This orange line is the emissions projection for the climate and energy policy recommendations from Project 2025. If you've never heard of it, Project 2025 is a sort of policy playbook for a potential Republican president, in this case, one Donald Trump. It was spearheaded by the Heritage Foundation and about 100 other mainstream conservative organizations, and it contains a ton of specific climate and energy policy goals that Energy Innovation was able to plug into their model to get a pretty scary look at an American future under Project 2025. It includes stuff like increasing liquefied natural gas capacity, increasing crude oil production, repealing the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure law, that kind of thing. Now this may just look like another regular old line, but Energy Innovation projects that path would dump billions more tons of carbon dioxide into the air, which would lead to some pretty disastrous climate outcomes, not to mention the litany of other problems that come from burning tons of fossil fuels.
It's been 1 week since you looked at me.
Project 2025 has been getting a lot of press lately, mostly because it feels like conservative groups are finally saying the quiet part out loud, and it's freaking a lot of people out. Project 2025 advocates for things like unchecked presidential power, the elimination of the Department of Education, a gutting of the EPA, and of course, a desire to, how do they phrase it?
If the American people elect a conservative president, his administration will have to eradicate climate change references from absolutely everywhere.
After all that came out, Project 2025 became a bit of a political liability that Trump has tried to distance himself from. I don't even know those guys, but I'm pretty confident we can use the policy recommendations in Project 2025, a document specifically crafted for Donald Trump by the Heritage Foundation, as a pretty good approximation of what another Trump White House could look like. Because roll the clip.
The critical job of institutions such as Heritage is to lay the groundwork, and Heritage does such an incredible job at that. Encourage new thinking, embrace new directions, and keep Heritage at the vanguard of the conservative movement. I think tremendous things are going to be coming out of Heritage.
And there's also this.
Heritage Foundation president, somebody else doing an unbelievable job.
And of course, who could forget his comprehensive energy policy plan?
We will drill, baby, drill.
Yeah. But there's also—
It's crazy that drill, baby, drill is a real quote.
Also a third line. And fortunately for us, it's one we can actually get excited about. Because if a president came into office and, actually tried to be a climate leader by enacting the kinds of policies that Evergreen Action has been nice enough to jot down in their Evergreen Action Plan 2.0, we could get this third line, a deep, sultry blue line. A line that gets—
I love these chatters. Not to be not a Trump person, but his term was not as bad as this current one, not to mention the full-blown genocide in Palestine. Really, what do you think, not to mention, other than the genocide, which by the way, he's okay with, what do you dislike about this this current one? What particular Biden policy has hurt you? Remember, a policy, okay? Something specifically that Biden did that made your life worse.
It's all the way down to net zero by 2050. I mean, good God, that's a nice looking line. But what can we do to make our reality look more like that really nice line? Great question. We take sweet, sweet action. We build a clean and effective national power grid. We decarbonize the industrial sector. We modernize and electrify our transportation systems. We electrify our homes and commercial buildings. We make polluters pay for the extensively documented messes they've left behind, and more. And this is one of those scenarios where you don't even have to care about climate change to benefit. Being a climate leader means leaning way into a clean energy transition. We'd be building out every part of an updated clean energy system, and that means a fucking ton of skilled, well-paid union jobs renovating and strengthening the grid, improving our public transportation networks, building out electric vehicle charging infrastructure, generating clean energy, the works. We're also looking at lowering overall energy costs as better power generation tech comes online and phases out the current technology of light things on fire or smash them till they explode. Believe it or not, hauling ass towards a clean energy revolution could actually save Americans money on their monthly energy bills. According to Energy Innovation, enacting an Evergreen Action Plan 2.0 style policy could save the average household almost $300 a year by 2030 compared to the Project 2025 plan. Being a climate leader is also about...
Wait, did they respond? No, they didn't respond.
Rebuilding and strengthening underserved and undersupported communities with worker and community programs. It's also about holding fossil fuel companies accountable for making a big mess and then not cleaning it up. And all of this is only possible if we elect a president who's going to push for climate action by enacting bold climate policy like a national clean energy standard and investing in clean American industry. And we're definitely not going to get anywhere near net zero by 2050 if our main plan to deal with climate change is to just...
Biden has been destroying people before he was even president. The crime bill has created the most clear disparity and opportunity between whites and blacks in modern politics. He created more imbalance while stabilizing the economy and via not creating a clear incentive to lock up blacks and tagging them for life with criminal records. Now to get to his disaster of a term, give me a moment to address this. Okay, so none of this has anything to do with his term. Don't worry, we're waiting.
Just
eradicate climate change references from absolutely everywhere.
But the cool part is if we get this right, it could go really great. We could actually build the future that people are excited about. We've all heard of horrifying tipping points that lead to climate catastrophe, but there are also positive tipping points caused by proactive climate action. The right mix of policy solutions can align climate, the economy, environmental justice, and labor incentives and cause massive decarbonization through the rare and coveted spiral into control. And look, I wish we had another 4 years to burn before we need to get moving, okay? I wish we didn't have yet another most important election of our generation, but we do. Because 2050 is really fucking close. To give you a sense of how close it is, Who Let the Dogs Out by the Baha Men was released in the year 2000. That's 24 years ago. That means we basically got one more Who Let the Dogs Out before it's 2050. So if you're sufficiently bought in, which I think is a reasonable assumption considering you just listened to 24 minutes of me yell at you about hanging chads in the electoral process, it is critically important that you get yourself registered to vote and that you vote. And when I say vote, I mean vote for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. That's right, I, Raleigh Williams, a guy with a YouTube channel called Climate Town, who has a master's degree in climate science and policy, am officially in favor of the candidate who might actually do something about the climate crisis. And honestly, I kind of make it a point not to get too endorsey in these videos, but the guy thinks climate change is a Chinese hoax to stop American manufacturing. And I am not saying that a Kamala Harris presidency would be a lock to get to net zero by 2050. It's still gonna take a ton of work. But with some good luck, some good policy, and some good advocacy, we could have an actual good shot at some genuine crisis-averting climate action. And if you want to do something right now, you can make sure you are registered to vote. Different states have different registration deadlines, so it would be extremely raven of you to go check your voter registration status online. Click the link down in the description to see if you're registered to vote already, and if you're not, register right there. Congratulations. And now you can lean into this doing your whole civic duty thing by checking out the playbook that our friends over at Climate Change Makers put together. One shockingly effective strategy is handwriting nonpartisan letters and sending them to voters in swing states with the Vote Forward campaign. If you're curious, check them out, link in the description. But whatever you do, just make sure you've got a plan to actually pull the lever, or punch the hole, or fold the origami, or whatever, okay? We're voting climate up and down the ballot. Bring some friends with you. Make a whole trip out of it, okay? Let's vote so hard that we win by 40. Because the closer it is...
Feels bad, man. What is this? You can attempt to create some framing around my sentiment with the mocking, condescending tone. Like I said something utterly ridiculous and irrelevant, but it does not change the fact that he is the worst president in modern-day America. What sort of ridiculous response is that to someone who has legitimate critiques? LOL, you are fantastic. I will stop here. Being mocked by a pseudo-intellectual is beneath even me. This is not a real sentence. This is not an English sentence. An internet troll. So you're 14. That's okay, but it's okay to be 14. It's okay to be 14. You still got time to get better, man. Don't worry. Don't worry, buddy. You got time. You got time to learn how to actually respond to questions like, name a particular policy in Biden's presidency that made his term bad. You just brought up the crime bill, which everyone already knows about. But sure. Anyways, guys. Yeah, go vote. Go vote, everyone. Feels bad, man. Feels bad. Oh, man. I still love Climate Town, but this video is just sad. I'm hoping, however, this one, perchance, might be fun. Perchance. John Oliver went on, I think, the New York Times podcast.